Hello, friends and partners, and I should say leveraged partners and everyone else. Uh, a lot of what, if you know me really well, a lot of this is not going to be new material to you. I've borrowed and copied many a slide from a couple different presentations over the last year or two, and so I'll just say that it's not anything too new to you. The other thing I'll quickly say is just from my background, I attended the University of Nebraska, got a couple degrees there, and went to work for NOAA about 25 years ago. I grew up on a feedlot in near Columbus, Nebraska. Not that I'm a farmer, not that I'm a producer, but I have been around that sector some. So anyway, I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, and I don't mean to go too fast, but I sort of have to. I also don't mean not to give a whole bunch of explanation about any particular thing, but if you see something that you want to know a little bit more about as I go through the slides, just jot it down, and I can come back to that and maybe fill that in a little bit more. Or maybe somebody on the presentation may know a little bit more than I do even about some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So this is pretty much an overview of what I consider something we call regional climate services is for the north central part of the United States. It is somewhat unique to our region for various reasons. We just have a lot of good cooperators and things like that. Okay, there we go. We have a lot of good cooperators, partners that we work with in this region, and that's not necessarily true in other parts of the country, to be honest with you. And I won't dwell on a lot of wordy things like this one too much, but what I will say is overall, if you want to know what climate services are, at least the definition that I use, is the development and delivery of climate information services that are on a time and spatial scale needed by most decision makers. And to be honest with you, that time scale often is a short time scale, not something, let's say 10, 20, 50 years into the future. Now, that said, there are times when people do want that type of information and do want it for various planning means and scenarios. Also, the spatial scales that people work at, generally, if you're in agriculture, they're working on their particular land. And that's a pretty small spatial scale, no matter how many acres they have. Again, there are others that want it at the state scale, county scale, regional scale, watershed scale, all that stuff. So there's many scales we work at, and it's good to know that there are a lot of people working at many different scales. And so one of the things I'll be doing here is talking about some of the other partners that we work with a lot, and refer to them as potential people to work with as well as myself. These are some of the major issues or major focus areas, I guess you could say, of regional climate services. Obviously, there's a monitoring aspect, and monitoring to me is for example, a map and looking at trends and what's happening with things like precipitation and temperature and any other variable you can possibly think in, growing degree days, and seeing how different the current and maybe even past climate has been, so people get a read on, why is it so, or does it seems cold or it seems hot? Where are we in that trend analysis there? Are we really is it really that hot of a summer? Is this winter really that cold of a winter compared to the way it was 20 years ago or even 50 years ago? That's a monitoring aspect as far as I'm concerned. Then there's the data aspect where you're collecting actual temperature data, for example, and putting that into a database for future use. There's a prediction element. I'm not going to go into a lot of information on prediction. We could talk all we wanted to today, or we could make a whole presentation on the Climate Prediction Center, which is part of NOAA, and other prediction tools that we have. a lot of people are very interested only in that, to be honest with you. And those predictions pretty much only go out about a year or so. There's a huge outreach component. You're all very aware of that. I don't need to explain that to you, as well as the education part. We do a lot of those things. And then there are research aspects to the job, very applied, as opposed to sort of nebulous information that people, that researchers do and nobody ever really cares about, at least in my field. They want to know very applied sort of, what's the word for, pragmatic information when they, out of the research that we do. And then there's a component of networking and being aware of what everybody else is doing in the whole climate realm. Okay, so those are the big things. Now I'm going to show a series of maps. I'm going to go very fast through these, but these are a number of partners that we work with across the climate landscape, and you'll see that there are federal agencies and others that all sort of work in this service aspect when it comes to climate. The first I'm showing you here is something called a Regionally Integrated Sciences and Assessments Group that is a NOAA-funded entities. And you see this big area in the Midwest where there's nobody. Well, I'm sorry about that, but there is no Midwest or even Great Plains, for that matter, funded Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Group. There is some work going on in and near the Great Lakes Basin, and there's some of that work going on in, as you can see, Colorado, Wyoming. But I don't think this group is the 12 states sort of in between those, right? Is that correct? Somebody shake their head. Yes. So I won't even explain what RESAs do, other than they do a lot of really good work with a lot of stakeholders as well, and sort of sort out a lot of the social aspects of how information gets transferred and who are the users and how they use it and a lot of that stuff. They do a lot of really good work that unfortunately we don't get a hold of. This is the National Weather Service regions. I actually sit down in Kansas City, Missouri, where that star is or close to it. These actually reflect where people in my position as well sit. I don't work for the National Weather Service. I work for a group. I work for NESDIS, which is another part of the NOAA, but the group you may have heard of is the National Center for Environmental Information, based down in Asheville, North Carolina. We have the same regions as the Weather Service does. I sit with a Weather Service regional office here, just to let you know the lay of the land. So for the most part, if you're watching this with this group, I'm sort of the, if you will, go-to guy for a lot of this stuff in your region. Hopefully you know about or have heard of the regional climate centers. Those are also NOAA-funded entities, one based in Lincoln, Nebraska, one based in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. I'll be saying a lot more about their work, or something more about their work. Again, each one of those entities could give you a heck of a presentation based upon what they do that might be of importance to you. I'll talk also a little bit more about this later. These are regions that are they're under a group called the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. You may have heard of NIDIS. Anyway, I'll talk more about them later, but you can see in the Midwest and in the Great Plains, for the most part, there are two focus areas, one Missouri River and one Midwestern DEWS. DEWS stands for Drought Early Warning System. And if I have time, I'll talk about that more. And then these are the states. Obviously, this is the states of the United States, and each of these have, almost every one of them has a state climatologist of one sort or another. The shading, I wouldn't worry too much about that, but each, for now, with this group, but like Laura Edwards, one of the people that is part of your group, is one of these state climatologists. And she can tell you a lot more about what they do and why they're so important, but they are pretty much part of the backbone of regional climate services not just for agriculture, but for across sectors, across the country. They are either, they're not federally, federal positions. They are either state or university-based people. Kind of going back to the Weather Service again, and I know this is a confusing puzzle map, but these are by county. These are the individual weather forecast offices across the country. You can see there's a lot of them. There's actually 122 of those. Is it important that you know where they all are? Probably not, but it's important that you know they all exist and that there are local people and there are climate people in each of those that have that do want to be able to work with people like yourselves on a number of issues. They don't have the expertise in agriculture and extension information that you do. They also are looking at a smaller area of the world, but they also like to get your type of information. They don't know what's going to be affected when it's going to freeze, for example, early in the spring or late in the spring, or I should say late in the spring or early in the fall. They don't necessarily know the implications of extreme events when it comes, especially to agriculture, necessarily. Now, that said, there are some offices like this one over here, DVN stands for Davenport, where there is a very good person who is sort of an agriculture, a specialist, I guess you could say, that works within the Weather Service because of his background. Anyway, on we go. These are the watersheds for the river forecast centers across the country. A river forecast center is a part of NOAA, is a part of the National Weather Service. They actually do flood predictions and things like that on their major rivers and tributaries to those major rivers. They also work in the climate realm. Shifting gears a little bit to other non-NOAA associated, if you will, climate groups. There is this North Central Climate Center and Northeast Climate Science Center, I should say. And those are their fuzzy boundaries for those. Those are part of the USGS and Department of Interior. Their focus often is, not only, but often is sort of ecosystem related, which is very broad. It's not a specialty that I have. They're also sort of climate, they are more focused on climate change than they are on sort of real time, if you will, climate information. Nonetheless, they are a group of federal and university partners that work together in those specific regions. The North Central one is based in Colorado. The Northeast version of all of this is based in Amherst, Massachusetts. But there are numerous university people, and you may know this already, numerous universities, I don't know how many, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 even, that are within that area that work very closely with them. So the University of Minnesota, for example, works in the Northeast. University of Nebraska, for example, works in the North Central. These are the USDA ag hubs, probably not a huge surprise to you where they exist. Ames, Iowa, and Fort Collins are the 2 big ones for the Midwest and Plains, and El Reno for Kansas there. I saw Mary Knapp was on, so throw her a bone there. And then there's all these other federal agencies, like these are the FEMA regions that exist across the country. They're very interested in resilience, especially after extreme events. We do try to help them as much as we can and help the states with climate information and such. Then there's the EPA regions, which actually you can see reflect the same, for the most part, reflect pretty much the same as the EPA and the FEMA are pretty much the same regions. We work a lot with them at the regional level. USGS has regions. The Bureau of Reclamation has these regions. Again, for this group, probably the Great Plains one would be the only one you work with there, if at all. And then there's the Corps of Engineers, who are very important to many of us as well. And those are their major divisions, I guess you could say. And then finally, the tribal lands and nations, if you will, stretch across the entire nation, pretty heavily across the north central part of the U.S. We have quite a few tribal lands and thus different sovereign nations to work with, and we do quite a bit with them, to be honest. There are some challenges in working in the climate services field. The word climate, for example, doesn't always go over well with people until you explain to them that we're not only, well, certain audiences, you temper your, if you will, language. Again, you all know this, to speak to different crowds and such. But also, I tend to temper the language when talking about climate issues across timescales. That tends to be okay. And then there's a lot of coordination that is another challenge that we have. You just saw all the different entities, and that is just part of the different groups. There's more than that work in climate-related along with climate-related issues. Extreme events, as you well know, take a heck of a lot of time to deal with. Whether it's a D4 drought, hopefully you know what I'm talking about there, to a major flood event or a major cold or even heat event. They really sap a lot of our time. But there are also opportunities. They're very good opportunities to meet a lot of folks, to emphasize certain things, and sometimes get funding, to be honest. Resources are always short. That's a challenge. Recognition of approach. Sometimes the fact that we go out and do a lot of talks and we do a lot of engagement isn't always appreciated by those who want to see, I don't know, different outcomes, and they want to see more. They don't understand the abstract part of this job as much. And then the other challenge we have is the predictive capacity. To be honest with you, it is tough, very tough to predict droughts before they come. There are certain times where we have a little better ability to do that, but prediction on climate issues, especially in the short term, is very difficult. And that's another discussion we could get into. Okay, so regional activities, generally for me, I just mentioned extreme climate events. They take a lot of time. The Northern Plains drought in 2017, ask Laura how much time that took her. And is continuing to take her, I should comment. She could probably do a couple different half-hour sessions on that. There are assessment and attribution parts to those after they're over, after an extreme event is over. We like to assess those depending upon how extreme the event was and what the impacts were. The attribution is more of a what caused it, science research question. The assessment's more of a what was the story there, what were the impacts. And then there's a lot of information delivery to multiple sectors, and you never know who's going to come out of the woodworks when it comes to extreme events. People really do care when their bottom line is being affected, bottom line. And then this NIDIS thing, this National Integrated Drought Information System. Again, I have a slide or two later. It's drought.gov. But anyway, there are two areas, the Midwest and Missouri Basin, that I work very closely with the coordinators in those areas. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but I serve as a NOAA tribal liaison for the north central part of the U.S. For my particular part of NOAA. And then the other part, which I'll talk a lot more about, are these regional information delivery partnerships that we have, mainly with webinars and excuse me, regional briefings that we do on a quarterly basis. So let's talk about the webinars a bit. These are open to the public, thus you all. This is done on a monthly basis, as it says up there. It's usually based on what is happening across the north central part of the U.S. We look at maps and things and look at temperatures and all that kind of business and try to understand soil moisture is another thing we look at. Depending upon the time of year, we look at a couple different aspects of the climate. So this time of year, things like snowpack are big. Ice in rivers can be a big issue. Plain snowpack, mountain snowpack, ice in the Great Lakes, that kind of thing, and just the trends in terms of weather. And I think I said soil moisture already. We also look at the outlook. What is the next 3 months or so going to look like? Sometimes we extend that to 6 months because we're getting into the agricultural time of the year where ag is impacted a lot more. We also have a question and answer section on each one of those. So if people have any questions, they can ask. We've had quite a few people, there are quite a few people registered to get on these. We've been doing them since 2012, actually since 2011 in the Missouri Basin, but 2012 across the entire region. Like I said, we partner very closely with the state climate offices, the National Drought Mitigation Center, and the USDA on these. So you'll see different folks. And there is if you want to register this year to get on one of these webinars to listen in, again, I haven't said this yet, but every third Thursday of every month is when they're held. You can simply link to that or go to that website and put your information in. You can also email me if you'd like to be put on a regional list to receive periodic updates for not only these webinars, but for some of the other things I'm going to be showing you in the future. If you're not on that list and you want to be, let me know. Yeah. Okay, so the webinars and who cares. Again, we've had over 5,500 participants in these things over the last few years. There are all levels of government, including tribal governments, NGOs, a lot of private people get on. I've even got people from Italy on these things. And I'm guessing they're commodities traders and such, because we do talk a lot about ag. That's the first line of impact, if you will. And so we talk about that. And what else do I want to say here? We've done some evaluations on the worth of these. And I think we've come to the conclusion that the audience really does like to tune into these to get different, depending on who you are and what you care to hear about. They do make use of this information. This is something that Tanya Haig, who I think is on the call as well, helped put together. These are findings from a survey that we did, and they're pretty on the actual webinars and the quarterlies, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So it's a type of climate information we tried to figure out if it was being used and if anybody appreciated it, was it relevant, blah, 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 and found out, yes, it is. And there's hopefully going to be a paper on that someday in some journal somewhere. And then more about the climate webinar and who cares. There's a lot of information of value that we found. These are, if you go down that list right there, these are the things that people like to hear about and they find valuable. And then at the bottom, some of the information that would be useful if we could add it. That's a couple of aspects of that. So a lot of those things are things people really care about during the year, during each month. Now here are the quarterly, well, we'll call this the brief section. So there's several different types of briefings that we put out. And these are really just a one-page, double-sided bunch of information, if you will. Looking back at the last 3 months and looking forward the next 3 months. Much of it in the first part of the quarterly describes what has happened in terms of big events. This one's very focused on the Great Lakes, this example. The next section is that climate section. We talk about what's going on in terms of precip and temperature and how different or how uncommon it's been. Then there on the back of that, if you flip it over, we talk about impacts, you know, who is being impacted in the last 3 months. And then the final section is outlooks and potential impacts for other sectors that could be impacted based upon the forecast, if you will. The other ones that we do, other kind of briefings that we do, here's one based on La Nina impacts. Again, this one is particularly focused on the Great Lakes. And we talk about what goes on with La Ninas in the Great Lakes. And yeah, and again, we put these out on an as needed basis. And then the final one I'll show you is another event-based one for the Northern Plains last year. We put this out in July. It was getting awfully dry up there, and we thought it was responsible to put out some information on the drought. And these are not made for climatologists to use. They're really made for people like yourselves or elected officials or anybody to get a kind of overview. We try to write them non-technically. And hopefully the public could understand them if they got a hold of them. And it's a multi-partner thing. It's not just NOAA people putting these together. It's the regional climate centers, the state climatologists, and USDA that usually help. A little bit more about NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System. So it's a multi-aspect group that is trying to do a lot of different work in terms of preparing the United States for drought better than the past. There really is no, until NIDIS came along, there was no coordinated effort to do that, believe it or not. There are state efforts, certainly, but there are not too many regional efforts unless you go to the Colorado River Basin, for example, where water has been short for a long time. But water wars, if you will, and water concern has become more and more of an issue as time goes on and demands increase as times go on. So this group is based in NOAA, again, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, in case you didn't know. They're based in NOAA, but they work across federal agencies, states, and tribal entities, as well as municipalities and other groups to enhance understanding of what drought is, enhance the monitoring, as it says there, of what is going on in your neighborhood, to enhance the predictions of drought, that work in that. And this part of this drought early warning system, which is sort of multifaceted, to be honest with you. This is a talk in and of itself, but if you want to know more about that, you can ask later. And then one of the aspects of NIDIS is to do things like this. So the 27 Northern Plains drought, although it's not over, the worst part, fingers crossed, is over. And this is something Laura is involved with, and many others, in trying to put this report together. This is going to be a report. This right here is a kind of a 2-page draft flyer, if you will, on that thing. Anyway, you can see all the different parts of this particular assessment. We do it for major drought events for sure. There are a number of these out there for like the 2012 drought. There's one of these for that if you want that. And then the other part of it is there's going to be another report on, like I mentioned earlier, something called attribution. How did this drought happen? How predictable was it? What were the causes of it? People always ask with every event, is it climate change? And so they do try to talk about if it's that rare of an event, or if it's likely to see more of these in the future. That'll be out later in 2018, the attribution study. I should say the assessment should be out by May 1st or so, if Laura does all the work that she's supposed to do. So now another aspect of climate services, if you will, and this one's really USDA and NOAA working together on sort of putting what we know a lot about. USDA knows a lot about agriculture and impacts, and NOAA knows a lot about weather and forecasts, if you will. So last spring, this is an example of how this worked, and those are dead cattle out there in the field. The way this worked was we saw sort of in advance that it was going to get pretty cold, and there was a potential for a pretty big snowstorm from the, if you will, Colorado high plains, sort of north and east from there into Kansas, and then across Nebraska and further north. Anyway, it had been very warm. If you remember last spring, it had been very warm. Things were starting to grow. We didn't want them to grow. We knew there was chances for frost still and freezes still happening and all that stuff. So we saw this, let's say 2 weeks to 10 days in advance, and said, hey, let's get something out to the public on this. And because, you know, cattle are going to be under the gun, wheat crops could be under the gun. And so working with USDA, Dennis Toddy in this case, out of Ames, Iowa, and I think various other people were involved. Sorry if I'm not saying your name, and you are or were. We put together a slideshow, and let's see. But before I get to that, some of the considerations for these regional briefings. First of all, we have to be able to see the event coming, and we have to recognize that if it did happen, that it would be impactful. You know, a big snowstorm in January, yeah, it's impactful, but golly, most crops aren't growing, and there's the impacts aren't the same as they are in late April, early May, certainly. So that's what we try to think about as we decide to do this or not. So as I say at the very bottom of the slide, the critical timing of things like fall harvest, or if it's going to be an early freeze in September, or whatever, or a late spring freeze. Is it a pollination seed filling time of year where it's really critical that you don't get overnight temperatures at 90 degrees for a week or two or something like that. Spring livestock issues we talked about, spring or fires in general. Spring fires or any time, fires can be a real bad thing. So if we see high winds, maybe, and very warm temperatures, and it's been dry, see, that's the other part, the antecedent conditions. And then, so those are all things that get us thinking about whether we should, I guess, issue, if you will, one of these briefs to highlight the potential for bad stuff happening. So here's what we put together last April, and this is the Weather Services, and NOAA is part of all of this. It shows where the precipitation will be. It says how much snow it's going to be. It talks about the temperatures. Okay, and then the next group of slides in that same briefing goes to what the USDA knows. And they know a lot about, well, here's the impacts for freezing in this area, potentially. Here's all the bad things that could happen to crops. Here's what the soils look like, and livestock in this case. So, and it did turn out, I hate to say that we were successful, but we were successful in terms of at least predicting some of the really bad stuff that happened during that event last spring. All right, another sort of NOAA USDA angle, and actually in this case there's a lot of extension input and lots of other stuff. So when I say USDA, I'm really talking about you all as well to some degree. I know it's not one-to-one, but it's close enough. Interpretation, collection, and translation of information is a lot of what we're trying to do with the USDA. As I just mentioned, real-time decision support, building tools like this corn growing degree day tool. If you don't know anything about that, I guess, let's see, Laura, again, I'll just pick on you. You can talk to them about all the U2U tools that are out there. The bottom line is to help make weather and climate information more usable by people in agriculture. And that's why USDA and you folks have to be a part of that sort of equation, I guess. So why do we work together? I think we've already talked about this. Capitalize on expertise. I don't know anything about ag. Perhaps you don't know anything about the weather. So we combine efforts. A lot of you guys know a lot about both, which is great. Major economic sector in this particular region, agriculture that is. My job is to work with any sector, and certainly USDA's is to work across many sectors, including agriculture. So we have similar priorities. We're also bound by impacts. They affect lots of different things, either whether it's too dry, too wet, too hot, too cold, all that. I'm going to skip that slide. I'm going to move over to tools for just a moment. Again, you could have a slideshow right here based upon, you could have, and you probably already have had, an introduction to U2U family of tools, if you will, which are now on the High Plains and the Midwestern regional climate centers. If you want to look at those or talk about those or present those in your talks and outreach, there are places to go to find out more about that. And they are all climate ag tools of some sort or another. Again, I'm not going into great detail about them. I'm also not going to go into great detail about all the regional, the RCC stands for Regional Climate Center their host of tools really focused on agriculture, from frost freeze to drought and irrigation planning, growing degree maps, and literally thousands of added value maps that could be very useful in your discussions and talks as you go out and talk to different people. From a monitoring aspect, the regional climate centers do a fantastic job of that. For example, the image there on the top is the percent of normal precipitation last June for about a week period. Showed how dry it was in Colorado and in western Kansas and up into Nebraska, and how wet it was actually in Wisconsin and Michigan and other places like that. That's something that they do on a routine basis. These maps are created daily, actually, and you can go pull those off and copy them and use them however you'd like to. And then the map below is a potential evaporation map from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. So there is an incredible amount of information out there. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail, and maybe we could have a couple more talks. You could have more talks on the Regional Climate Center's abilities and information they have to offer. We have talked about expanding the tools for that useful to usable, U2U, information, climate and ag information, to other crops, because it's really based right now primarily on corn. It was a Midwest project and was really focused on corn and to some degree soybeans, but moving those tools to different areas and different crops might be something to do in the future. Some ideas that we've heard are wheat and alfalfa and other specialty crops. I add this NC 1179 group in here because although I'm not a part of the group, I pay attention to them because they do climate work when it comes to agriculture. All I'm saying on this particular webinar is that they exist, and maybe a number of you are part of that as well. You can talk about that more. I'll talk a little bit about the National Climate Assessment a little bit later. So supporting and sustaining planning resilience and temporally and geographically. Oh, I'm all talked out, I think. But anyway, build capacity and awareness with USDA and NOAA partners, Extension plus NOAA National Weather Service offices. I'm going back to that theme of how can we get Extension and Weather Service local offices more aware of each other's needs and information that they have. Not sure how to do that, but it sounds to me like you guys are sort of on the road to at least building your capacities and understanding what the Weather Service has to offer at least. And then maybe we could work with you a little bit more on who the contact points in those local weather offices are, or how to get a hold of them if you need information, that kind of thing. Building on this early warning concept, most people think about early warning and tornadoes and things like that. Excuse me, I'm doing a quick time check here. Early warning also can be used for a number of aspects in terms of climate. If, for example, last year in Montana, we were sort of caught unaware that it was getting dry to the point where ranchers were needing or thinking they needed to sell off some of their stock. Maybe wheat crops were abandoned, things like that. Those triggers came pretty early in their minds. We weren't quite sure that they were doing, we didn't know that they were doing that until a little later, until after they had started. That kind of stuff is stuff we like to know more about. So an early warning concept would build a lot of that, people's trigger mechanisms into how we look and monitor the information, so we can get that information out to them a little earlier. And then opportunistic place-based meetings. I'm talking about when there's a big drought. Again, this is something you probably all do, is when there's a big drought or a big flood or something, you're dispatched out to talk to farmers and ranchers about perhaps, or could be, what the potential for this drought to break is, and all other, and sort of giving an awareness of what's going on out there in the atmosphere and the ground, and how bad is it, and when is it going to get better. RCCs with NOAA and USDA are holding regionally focused collaborations. Okay. Whew. we do that, and we do tend to do that more when there are, if you will, extreme events going on. But I think in this case, it would be better for the USDA ag hubs to talk more about some of those collaborations, especially in the Midwest and specialty crops. There's a whole bunch of interest out there on specialty crops, which basically aren't your major row crops, anything other than those. Challenges and opportunities. Okay, I'm going to keep going on that. Here is this is a 2-page briefing that the High Plains Regional Climate Center put out. It has a number of different entities like the High Plains Regional Climate Center, the National Drought Mitigation Center, the NRCS, USGS, and why those particular groups are important, because each one of them has some aspect in water or drought or climate that could be useful to you if you want to go look at their information online. So this is sort of a, if you will, a cheat sheet. Oh, it also mentions the webinars and that we record them and you can go listen to them after the fact, the monthly webinars and the quarterly, monthly climate summaries and that kind of stuff. And then a bunch of contact people. Okay, relatively shortly, I'm going to go through this really fast. There is this thing coming out called the 4th National Climate Assessment. You may remember in 2014, if you were around in the May of 2014, actually, the last climate assessment came out for the country. I'm not going to go into great detail, but 13 federal agencies, NGOs, and private interests sort of put these things together. This climate science special report is already out. It describes the science of basically climate change across the United States. It's a great document to have in your back pocket. There's a link to it on here at the very bottom of this slide. Whoop. There's a link to it right there. It's the whole report and the executive summary can be found at this place. There's a lot of things to steal out of that, and I say that in a good way in terms of maps and things across the U.S. It is a broad-based report for the entire U.S., and I'm saying that because then that's volume 1. Volume 2 is going to be a sector-based and regional-based, have regional-based chapters within it. So that volume 2 is going to come out at the end of the year, this year, and it's going to have all these different sectors that you see on your screen before you: water, energy, agricultural, rural communities, forests, land cover, land change, tribal, indigenous communities, et cetera, et cetera. There'll be a chapter on each of those topics, okay, in terms of climate change, how climate is changing and changed. And then here's the regional breakdown of all the different regions that will be in that report as well, okay? Again, I use it as sort of my climate change Bible when it does come out, because there are so many great graphics in there to use to explain things. And I would highly advise this group getting together and having just to talk about, when it does come out, just about that and how it could be useful to you all. Briefly mention this. This is coming out in the mid-year sometime. There is an ongoing sort of reporting of how much carbon is being released by various groups in various sectors and all that kind of stuff. Somebody is trying to measure that. That's what this report is. There is obviously this is the second one, but there was a first one, but now we're trying to recalculate the amount of CO2 basically being put into, and who's doing it and how much is being captured and where it's going and all that kind of stuff. That's what this report is. And I think that's all I have to say. Sorry to take all the time in the world, but that's it. Thank you. I hope it was interesting at least.
Thanks, Doug.